Hi everyone, and welcome to the second virtual workshop that the PSA Environment are hosting today, which is part of our theme on COVID-19 and environmental politics, examining how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted environmental politics and the changes that we're going to see as a result of that. So please make sure that you check out our keynote talk by John Dryzek, as well as the rest of our panels today. So I'm thrilled to be able to introduce you to the panel that we have assembled today, which includes John Vogler from the University of Keele, Alex Scott from E3G, Katia Simeonova from the UN, and Robert Falkner from the Grantham Institute at LSC. Each of our panelists is going to have 10 minutes in order to speak to you about a particular aspect of the way in which the pandemic has impacted climate diplomacy. And then we're going to have time for questions and answers. So in order to ask a question of our panel, I'm going to ask that everyone uses the chat feature at the bottom of the screen. I'll put up a message soon so that you can all see that. And that way I can moderate that chat and ensure everyone's kind of questions get asked. We all have time to kind of really engage with what our participants have to offer today. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker today, and we're delighted to have John Vogler with us from the University of Keele. John.
Okay, am I coming through okay?
Yes.
So I'm coming through okay, am I?
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for convening the meeting. In my 10 minutes, I thought I would make 3 points. I'll start with the obvious. If one's answering the question, how has the pandemic affected climate diplomacy? I'll start with the obvious, which is, as well as distorting everything else, or most aspects of our lives, it of course interrupts the normal diplomatic processes. It cancels or even delays meetings. This is obviously an immediate problem, but I think one of the things that we might care to think about is whether this might be turned to advantage. I'm thinking in particular of the year's delay in COP26. So that's the obvious, that's one initial obvious point. The second point, which I think is rather more serious, is the question of how the pandemic alters national priorities. These have clearly shifted. Now, environmental issues in international politics were always subject to the issue attention cycle. But I think we're seeing something rather dramatic going on here. If we take the case of Britain, the COP26 presidency, in January 2020, a senior official said that COP26 represented the highest diplomatic priority, and I quote, for the United Kingdom. By the beginning of the next month, in early February, one tended to doubt this when you read Claire O'Neill's resignation letter, in which it was clear things were already going wrong with the British presidency. And by the time you get into March, April of this year, it is very clear, I think, that just looking at the British government, that there has been a reordering of its diplomatic priorities. And one wonders where climate diplomacy, where COP26 actually sits within the order of priorities of the UK government. And I'm sure that's the same elsewhere. There are a whole range of issues here relevant to climate diplomacy and relevant to COP26. One thing that I think one should think about is how this affects the mechanisms of the Paris Agreement, the if you like, the emulative mechanisms of the Paris Agreement. How does it affect the way in which the ratchet mechanism is supposed to work? And in the very near term, the kind of the attempt that the British government is making to get countries to scale up their NDCs. And the obvious other point to make here is the prioritization of near-term economic recovery in the front, taking priority almost over everything else. And when one looks around, the evidence here is rather disappointing. Is rather disappointing in the sense that it does not yet appear that governments have taken the opportunity to seize the opportunity of building back better, as it were. There seems to be quite a lot of prioritization of short-term economic recovery involving fossil fuel investments. So that's my second point. I think it is definitely shifted national priorities, and this may be to the detriment of climate diplomacy. And one can look at the specific case of the UK presidency here, I think. Now, the third thing I'd like to say, the third point I'd like to make is a much broader one about the conduct of international relations. I think it was already clear that the kind of conditions, the international conditions that facilitated agreement in 2015 were not going to be reproduced in 2020. One can tick off the issues here. First, of course, the arrival of the Trump administration, the way in which it almost defines itself in terms of opposition to international climate action. Then related the declining relationship between geopolitical, people would say now, relationship between the United States and China under the Trump administration, and the kind of way in which Xi Jinping and the Chinese regime have reacted to the Trump administration. Then there are a whole range of regional conflicts that have been exacerbated and are going on as by, I think, that will be exacerbated by the pandemic. I think in particular what's going on in the Eastern Mediterranean and the struggle over hydrocarbon resources between Greece and Turkey and others in the Eastern Mediterranean. Brexit we cannot avoid, and I think one can speak of the general, and many people do speak of the general erosion of the liberal multilateral order. Now, most of these trends have clearly been exacerbated by the pandemic. One can see this notably in US-China relations, the way in which the United States has blamed China, its proposed withdrawal from the WHO. As I say, this is part of a pattern. It's a part of a pattern of a decline of the multilateral order. At one point, the United States administration even threatened to leave the Universal Postal Union. I want to raise the question of how far climate diplomacy can be abstracted from these overall trends in the international political system and great power relations. Now, if you read the specialist literature on international relations, and this is a sort of on international cooperation, and this is a long-standing bugbear of mine, it tends to suggest that it is possible to abstract functional environmental relations from what one might call as more general overall international politics. But I think the popular conception now is that this is not the case. If you read the press, climate now has a certain amount of salience still, and much weight is put upon the need for accommodation between the major powers. There is much hope that there will be change in the United States, and the relationship between the US and China is seen to be absolutely critical. Now, I think that's been so in the past. I think if you look at the record of 2009 and 2015, clearly some accommodation between the Chinese and the Americans has been highly significant. What I want to ask now, what I've investigated, is how far the overall structures and processes of world politics do generally determine what happens in the climate regime. Now, I think they do. You can't really abstract the climate regime from the underlying structures of the international system. However, there are certain ways in which the interests and alignments that you get within climate politics do not follow the normal contours of world politics in terms of their parallel alignments. If we want to go back, I mean, I always think 1977, Cohen and Nye their distinction between overall structure and issue structural power is quite useful here, because it's clearly the case that if you look at climate alliances, they differ from normal, if you like, political strategic alliances. And you can see this in the Western world, in the way in which the umbrella group differentiated itself from the European Union. You can see it within BASIC, and of course the relations within BASIC have clearly been pretty bad recently. If you look at relations between China and India and the kind of conflicts that have been going on in the Himalayas between them, and of course the bad relations between China and Bolsonaro's regime in Brazil. So it is possible, it has been the case in the past, that despite poor relations on other dimensions of international politics, there have been common interests in the climate regime. So there are particular sources of power and alignment in the climate regime that don't fit entirely with what is going on elsewhere in world politics. And when you add to this that I think the United Nations Framework Convention is a very interesting, highly institutionalized, and in some ways quasi-democratic institution, which is rather different from what one gets elsewhere in international politics, has its own sources of structural power and influence. People normally note the significance of AOSIS, for instance, and the kind of normative influence that it can exert. So this, I think I'm getting towards the end of my 10 minutes now, but if I can pose the question at the end, and it seems to me to be a vital question. We see the deterioration of general international politics. Is this necessarily going to be reproduced as we move towards COP26? This seems to be an absolutely vital question, because great power relations and wider international relations have clearly, some of the negative trends have clearly been accelerated by the pandemic. But are these necessarily going to carry over into the efforts of the UK presidency to make a success of COP26? I shall terminate there. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's a fascinating paper and a really provocative question for us all to kind of focus on going forward. So I'm going to hand over now to Alex Scott from E3G for her perspective on this question.
Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, John. Very interesting question you're posing to us there. I'm Alex, I'm from E3G, which is a European think tank, so less versed in some of the academic processes and methodologies in assessing climate politics, and more in strategizing around the political economy of climate change and trying to craft the conversations that can move that politics forward. So we've just put up a new tagline on our website, because no time like the present when everything else is changing around us, which is that we are trying to change the world one conversation at a time. So thank you, Ashley, for inviting us into this. Looking forward to seeing the results of the world changing conversation we're about to have. But what I wanted to quickly run through is a very quick recap of the context that we were in before COVID-19 hit. A bit of an overview of what's changed, and then the three main challenges that we're projecting into the conversations we're having about the political economy of climate change. So starting with that context, and I think John picked up on some of these aspects as well, but really what we were talking about in terms of climate politics and climate action before COVID was a completely different scale of political challenge to the pre-Paris era, where we were focused on building that climate regime. We weren't focused on building that robust climate regime anymore, but actually implementing the complete transformation of economy. So the kind of scale of the challenge was already completely different. We weren't just looking for outcomes in that UNFCCC space from the UK's COP26 presidency. We were looking to the UK to drive outcomes across economic sectors, drive structural changes in the finance sector, finance system, and really see it bring about a step change in the seriousness with which the geopolitical alliances were addressing climate risk and resilience. And we had a few tailwinds that have been picked up around the kind of public salience and public attention given to climate change, starting to bring about the engagement of central bankers, the falling costs of low carbon technology. But even before COVID hit, we were in this huge amount of headwinds, geopolitical headwinds, that we were trying to drive the climate conversation through. And many of those changes still remain in this post-COVID world. We've still got a bit of a vacuum in climate leadership. We don't have the US leading the charge on multilateralism in general, but also not on climate. We've got a lot of uncertainty in the geopolitical tensions. We don't know what's going to happen as a result of the US election. That uncertainty still remains. Uncertainty in how China will show up on the international stage, and the hawkishness with which other countries and regions will be reacting to China. We've also got little political jeopardy in the international system to push countries on climate ambition. The reputational damage of some of the human rights issues, for example, or other major global issues have already been internalized in those countries. So there's little leverage to push climate ambition through, and that legacy of distrust that really came to the fore around COP25 from the North-South dynamics is still very prevalent now. And now that COVID has brought about this disruption, we are seeing some obvious kind of practical implications. Firstly, that delay, as John picked up, to the diplomatic processes, the delay to the COP. There's no progress on some of the negotiating issues that were outstanding in solidifying the climate regime itself in the UNFCCC processes, the global stocktake, etc. We're also not seeing the face-to-face diplomacy, or there's less opportunity, for that face-to-face diplomacy, and the uncertainty in the diplomatic calendar with lockdowns and the restrictions on travel means building the geopolitical coalitions to drive that climate ambition is a lot more difficult without the face-to-face diplomacy, and there's less space for the kind of real economy diplomacy that would be targeting the structural changes that we were needing to drive in the finance system, in particular economic systems, energy, transport, etc. But it also means that there's no longer a rhythm of the kind of international moments at which governments want to announce new policy platforms. So there's less leverage to drive some of the national policy platform changes at the national political level. But what we're really observing is that the major shift from COVID in the geopolitical space is that where we previously thought of climate change as potentially a driver of geopolitics in a rather flat geopolitical landscape, that vacuum in geopolitical dynamics that we were observing previously has been well and truly filled by the economic and social challenges of COVID-19, which means that we're no longer trying to drive geopolitics from climate change policy and diplomacy, but rather trying to ride the waves of COVID geopolitics. And that means mainstreaming climate into economic and political decision-making and geopolitical dynamics and foreign policy a lot faster than we had been expecting to. We've had the inequities that were already apparent in the international system really exacerbated by COVID, and that is going to lead to further implications for those north-south dynamics that we were talking about. The social contract is a little bit under threat, both globally and nationally. The fiscal space and debt challenges in all countries are significant, but particularly in the vulnerable countries, the developing and emerging economies, which plays a huge role in defining the political dynamics between countries negotiating on climate change issues. And one of the other big challenges is that the political salience that climate had is dwindling. There are plenty of other crises happening at the same time that are distracting attention. The school strikers and the Extinction Rebellion voices that were making immediate impact aren't having the same impact anymore. And the climate change disasters that were having quite a big media impact just aren't having that same, aren't getting that same attention anymore. So the consequence of all of this is we're seeing huge uncertainties within that geopolitical landscape. There are so many different unknown drivers operating and interacting with each other at the moment that it's quite difficult to map through what the potential geopolitical outcomes might be. And the range of outcomes by the end of 2021 are completely extreme. We could see a Biden presidency working with the EU and weakening autocracies worldwide, driving a huge wave of cooperation. We could see a re-elected Trump government exacerbating US-China tensions, a huge global recession, leaving really no space for climate change cooperation and kind of sublimating climate change underneath the other global issues that countries are dealing with. So what we're bringing out of the political economy analysis that we've been doing in E3G is 3 major new meta challenges to climate actors. And the first one is this scale of COVID economic recovery packages, and recognizing that the economic recovery packages that governments will be putting together will be influencing the space for climate ambition and action over the next decade. So the real challenge is not just to drive this recovering better diplomacy, but also mainstream climate into the economic decision making at the national and international level. And some of the key questions that we're coming up with here are around how we might be able to see the UK and the EU driving a Build Back Better diplomacy approach with some of the other impactful players like China, Japan and South Korea. Where can this idea of recovering better be some of the geopolitical thread between those countries, but also where can we move beyond the economic rhetoric, which is kind of in favor of the green recovery at the moment, into actually building the institutional home globally to track and monitor and course correct on the recovery packages, and where can some of the cooperation between those key leading countries drive some of that global governance around a better recovery. The second major challenge is in building bridges to wider resilience issues. There's a big risk at the moment of climate being pitted kind of in competition with other issues linked to this issue of less salience to climate issues, but also to the scale of other risks apparent in the national and international systems. So a key challenge to climate actors is to build an approach to some of the issues around the fiscal security risks that vulnerable countries are facing. So where can we see, for example, an approach built to climate-aligned debt management to ensure that those emerging economies and vulnerable countries maintain some fiscal space to address the climate crisis at the same time as the immediate health and social crises that they're facing. And then finally, picking up this threat to the multilateral system as a whole, which, as John mentioned, was definitely apparent before COVID hit as well, recognizing that climate action really rests on having a strong rules-based international order in many respects. There's a new challenge to, in this post-COVID environment, sustaining the kind of trust and investment in that multilateral rules-based system. So one of the challenges that we're trying to focus on and keen to hear perspectives from the participants in this workshop today is around where are there opportunities for climate change cooperation to be a bit of a golden thread weaving through all of the challenges that we're experiencing at the moment to bring about that reinvestment in the multilateral system. Where can climate change cooperation rebuild some of the bilateral relationships, but also encourage reinvestment in some of the other international institutions to strengthen resilience governance as a whole at the international level? Where can some of those innovations in global governance be driven from a climate politics perspective? And I'll stop there. Thanks, Ashley.
That's great, Alex. Thank you so much for that fantastic presentation. So I'm now going to hand over to Katia Simanova, who's joining us from Germany today and works with the UN. Katia is the coordinator of the subsidiary body for implementation, the UNFCCC, and she's also manager of the Transparency Division. So I'm really glad that we get to hear her perspective on these issues of climate diplomacy. Katia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. It's a pleasure to me to be part of this distinguished panel and to speak on COVID-19, climate diplomacy, and also to provide my take on the outlook for COP26, with the caveat that I express my own views and not necessarily views of my organization. Let me start by recalling that 2020 remains a critical and important year for climate action and ambition, despite the dramatic change in geopolitics that we observe in the last few years and the COVID pandemics. And the reason is that this is 2020 when governments are expected to boost significantly their climate ambition through submission of NDCs that are due this year. And this is essential because these are the NDCs that will define the climate action in the decade to come. And they will also define the degree of narrowing the gap between the climate action and the imperative defined by science towards achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. As both John and Alex emphasized, we are living now in a world that is constrained by COVID-19 pandemics, and the attention of the governments are rightly placed on safeguarding the health and well-being of people. However, climate emergency does not take time off from pandemics, nor has the pandemic put us on a track that is consistent with the pathways that will lead us to the goals of the Paris Agreement. And therefore, when we look at one of the key questions, or maybe the key question, which is in the national and international policy agenda at the moment, which is the COVID recovery, we really need to think in smart and innovative ways on the opportunities for recovery better from COVID-19 and how we can link this recovery with climate emergency and how to deal with these two huge challenges in a holistic way. I'm making this point clearly recognizing and kind of being fully aligned with what John said so far, that there is still so far not that much good evidence of governments around the globe taking this opportunity and moving it forward, although there are some evidences. So now let me provide you with a few highlights on how the UNFCCC responded to COVID challenge. First of all, decisions have been taken by the COP Bureau that guides the work of under the UNFCCC between the sessions of the COP to postpone the two sessions of subsidiary bodies and COP26 to 2021. Effectively, this means that we don't have any negotiating sessions under UNFCCC this year. But this also means that work did not stop. And as many organizations have done already since March this year, we have switched all the UNFCCC activities to virtual modes. And the highlight of these activities is the June Momentum on climate change that took place from 2nd to 12th of June during the original time slot of the sessions of the subsidiary bodies in the summer. Currently, we are planning another kind of similar event, which is called UNFCCC Climate Change Dialogues, that are scheduled to take place between the 23rd November and the 4th of December. The objectives of these dialogues is to ensure the timely implementation of the activities that have been mandated for 2020. And in order to keep the delivery of the mandates for COP26 in 2021 and to ensure that we will remain on track for the successful delivery at COP26, while in the same time being mindful of the impacts from COVID and aiming at minimizing these impacts. We had also at the end of August a meeting of the Bureau of the COP that I mentioned takes decision between the COP sessions that focus very much its work on what to do in order to allow COP26 to deliver on the unfinished business from COP25, but also on the mandates for 2020 and 2021. And Bureau arrived at 4 criteria that should be implemented when organizing activities under the UNFCCC. The first is to maintain the original timeline for the mandates and submission deadlines to the extent possible. Second is to maintain the mandated number of meetings and deliver reports of the constituted bodies, which are the bodies where most of the substantive and technical work takes place between the sessions. And thirdly, to extend the current membership of various bodies established under the UNFCCC process in order to allow these bodies to progress their work despite the lack of sessions where decisions of the changing of the membership could be taken. And lastly, to organize events in 2020 that were scheduled to be held in 2020 through virtual mode to the extent possible, realizing that there might be some exceptions of this approach. And importantly, Bureau also agreed on the overarching objectives that will guide the UNFCCC work in this carbon constrained world this year and in the lead up to COP26. Which is to maximize progress and minimize disruption and delay. And again, we are fully mindful of the changes of geopolitics, of the constraints coming from COVID pandemics, but these are the overarching objectives that will be guiding our work. And now I would like to move to the third and last point, which I would like to make in my intervention, which is the outlook for COP26. UNFCCC COPs are best known for delivery of the legal instruments under the Climate Convention, which are the Kyoto Protocol and recently the Paris Agreement, and the rules that guide the implementation of these legal instruments, which are the Marrakesh Accords for the Paris Agreement or Katowice implementation guidelines for the Paris Agreement. And indeed, COP26 is expected to deliver the last tally of the unfinished business from Katowice and remaining part of the rulebook or implementation guidelines on three issues, which is Article 6 or mechanisms, on technical aspects of the implementation of modalities, procedures, and guidelines of Katowice package that implements the provisions of Article 13 on transparency, and hopefully also common timeframes for NDCs. What is, however, critically important for COP26 is to build momentum in the global effort to respond to climate emergency. And this is because while Paris Agreement is clearly a major achievement in climate diplomacy, it only provides a blueprint. And what matters from now on is the implementation through ambitious action by parties and other stakeholders. And this is the large-scale mobilization and generating momentum for strong action that is required by science that could be achieved through hard work in the lead-up and during the COP and through diplomatic outreach at all levels to which both Alex and John spoke to some extent. This should be the effort that can ensure, essentially, on my view, three things. First of all, that governments submit ambitious new and updated NDCs before COP26, even though it's very clear at this point of time that they may not be able to maintain the original deadline, which is 2020. Secondly, that support is provided to developing countries to take ambitious action on the ground on climate mitigation and resilience, and that this support is growing. And here we can see a clear nexus to any possible recovery package through international finance institutions that can really be designed in smart and innovative ways to allow to deal with the issues of debt and recovery in a holistic way with addressing climate mitigation and resilience. And thirdly, that the subnational and local governments, businesses, civil society, and other stakeholders are coming forward with actions and initiatives that go beyond the existing or near-term commitments by the government. And this is, on my view, this kind of new narrative on the new momentum and ambitious action to reduce emissions and to increase the resilience that can help to prepare and deliver at COP26 along with the negotiating outcomes for which we are all preparing at all levels, including with the very helpful engagement by the COP26 team by the UK government. In concluding, I would share with you that my assessment is that postponing COP26 is definitely a challenge in such a highly regulated and kind of process that is driven by decisions and legal agreements such as the UNFCCC. But this is also an opportunity to prepare and deliver at COP26 despite COVID-19 pandemics, and by using all the opportunities for green recovery that is provided between now and COP26. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Katia. Really great to hear that UN perspective there on these issues. So our final speaker of this panel, we're lucky to have Robert Falkner from the Grantham Institute at LSE to speak to us. Robert, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley, and thanks to my panelists for joining in this conversation. I want to zoom out a little bit from Katia's remarks about the UNFCCC process. I want to reflect again a bit more about the background conditions that need to be in place for a successful outcome in the climate negotiations. So I'm going to take a kind of a bird's eye view of the whole process. And I'm going to base my comments on how I interpret the Paris Agreement and how it works, the kind of logic of the Paris Agreement. And here I would argue that there are two critical conditions that need to be met for the Paris Agreement to work. The first one is we need national level action. Mitigation is predicated on the idea that countries are willing to act on their own, in their own areas of responsibility, without negotiating the exact amount of mitigation effort they're making through an international agreement. It's the bottom-up logic of the Paris Agreement. The NDCs are nationally determined, as the title suggests. And the second condition is that this is then embedded into a framework of international cooperation. So states, although they determine their own mitigation level, still want to know what other countries are doing, and they will try and they will try and review and then drive up the ambition in the system and then monitor each other's implementation. This then creates trust, and this allows countries to become more ambitious over time. So that's the, if I want to simplify the Paris Agreement, that's the basic logic that we're dealing with. And my question for my remarks is therefore, how has COVID affected those two elements in the Paris logic? And unfortunately, on the first point, on the national level action question, the impact is somewhat positive, but fairly mixed. Unfortunately, on the international cooperation bit, the outcome, the impact of COVID is fairly negative. And I want to just briefly run through those 2 points. Let's start with national level action. It's interesting to note that the pandemic jumped to the conclusion that this shows that mitigation levels can be brought down if only there is the political will to do something. I hasten to add that this is perhaps less promising than it may seem, although there was an immediate fall as soon as most industrialized countries went into lockdown in February, March, and April. Many people stopped working from commuting to work and started working from home, so it was possible to bring emissions down. But in the latest UN estimate, the overall level of global emissions this year in 2020 is likely to be lower than usual by between 4 and 7%. And one just has to let that sink in. Some of the world's leading emitters forced their populations to stay at home and stop traveling. Manufacturing was partially shut down, a lot of businesses stopped working, and we are likely to bring down emission levels by only 4 to 7%. So it just goes to demonstrate how difficult it will be to continue to drive down emissions, and by an accelerating pace. It's expected that this year we are bringing emissions back to the year of 2006. If that's all we've achieved to take the clock back in the 1 year that we've taken these drastic measures to 2006, then that really shows the magnitude. Starting now in Europe, emission levels jump very quickly to pre-COVID levels. So that's not more in the sort of discursive ideological shift that we've experienced with regard to the role that the state plays in directing the economy. And that's where I see a more positive long-term outcome from the COVID experience. Around the world, whatever the domestic political setup is, most countries have gone through a dramatic expansion of the state's role in running the economy, both requisitioning pharmaceutical companies and other manufacturers of essential health kit to produce on command, but also the state taking over a much bigger role in supporting struggling businesses, directing them, supporting workers. The fiscal expansion of the state is palpable around the world. That suggests that many populations, when faced with a dramatic health crisis, and one hopes they would reach the same conclusion when it comes to the climate crisis, are willing to accept a much bigger role for the state in terms of directing the economy. If that carries over into a post-COVID world, there's some glimmers of hope there. The Green New Deal debate in Europe is firmly entrenched. Even in the United States, that debate, particularly on the Democratic side, is now pretty much settled. We are expecting a green recovery package around the world. That is providing a glimmer of hope. We should expect the state to be much more interventionist and directive in terms of demanding a green form, a climate-friendly form of recovery. And that's where I think we should expect a strengthened basis for climate action in the years to come. But of course, it is a huge challenge, and this was mentioned before by other speakers. The fiscal burden on the state has risen. Taxes will either have to rise or debt levels will rise further. And this creates some level of policy competition between climate investment and other forms of investment. So the jury is still out on that. The second factor I mentioned earlier, international cooperation, and the way in which we create a system of mutual trust building, of mutual monitoring, and then the ratchet mechanism. That has taken a big knock from the crisis. John and other speakers have already alluded to the deeply worrying trends in the China-US relationship. We've seen various hits to multilateral institutions. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is in crisis, thanks not least to American unwillingness to work with the WTO in its bilateral relationship with China. The WHO has not come out well out of the pandemic due to both internal dysfunctional features, but also, again, US attacks on the role that it might play in a kind of pandemic management approach. And so multilateral approaches overall are in decline, and there's been a retreat to much more nationalist policies in this area. But the biggest worry surely must be the deterioration, the worsening of the relationship between the US and China, which is focused on trade, which is focused on technological leadership, and therefore on critical areas that will be important to international climate cooperation. If the two leading emitters are not willing to work together to facilitate, for example, the free-flowing exchange of green technologies, which are increasingly becoming focus in the technology competition that both countries are locked in, that really casts a dark shadow over future climate cooperation. Contrast this with what happened in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. In November 2014, President Obama and Xi Jinping had a bilateral meeting and signed a bilateral deal on climate cooperation. This, many people argued at the time, paved the way for the successful conclusion of the Paris talks. We are not only far from reaching such levels of bilateral cooperation, we have a complete lack of willingness to even engage in bilateral talks. Now, the US and China alone cannot fix the climate process. But if the two leading emitters are unwilling to engage at the bilateral level, let alone multilateral level, then that is a deep problem. Obama spoke of a special responsibility of the US in this area. What is the likely impact on this? I think it's right to say that the COP process is somewhat insulated. John and others referred to this. But please remember, the insulation effect that the climate process benefits from is largely down to the fact that until recently it's been seen as part of low politics, not part of the core interests of states in terms of their interest in managing great power relations, but also in terms of system stability. If, however, climate change is increasingly seen as a central concern to key states because of the huge threats that it poses to economic prosperity, to the physical and environmental well-being of society, then surely that insulating effect will wear off. The COP will be dragged into great power competition. And in that sense, I think the US-China relationship is of critical importance to how the COP plays out. We can probably carry on debating technical issues around implementation without letting the broader geopolitical climate impact on us, but that will not create the kind of political momentum that we need to really raise ambition in the process. And that's where it matters hugely whether the next US president, whoever it is willing to invest political capital in making much more ambitious promises and measures, willing to provide what he's announced before, climate leadership, and is willing to submit a more ambitious climate mitigation program. It's interesting to note, as yet, China has yet to submit a revised NDC in the run-up to next year's COP26. That's missing, and one can see where the domestic pressure is coming from. That's pushing against that. So let me conclude. I think the outlook, the medium-term outlook, is not looking too great. We have, of course, much bigger headaches in other areas of international cooperation, but they're starting to cloud the climate process. If there's only one hope we can take away from the past record of great power relations, then it is perhaps this, that even at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union and the United States were able to cooperate on environmental issues. They, in a sense, parceled out the environment as one area that doesn't affect their great power rivalry. But that, of course, means the environment, in this case, climate change, would be seen as a low politics area, and that's not the basis for effective climate cooperation. Good. Let me stop here and let's look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. And yeah, as Robert suggests, we've now got just over half an hour for questions. So if at the bottom of your screen you see either the Q&A feature or the chat feature, if you can please post your questions into those boxes, I can pick them up and pose them to our attendees. We've already got some really great questions coming through. And in order to give you some time to think about questions, I just wanted to ask if our panelists had any questions that they'd like to ask each other. If there's anything they wanted to pick up on having heard the other presentations.
Perhaps, if I'm allowed, I'm the last speaker, but perhaps I can do the first question. Question to Alex and Katia. Since you are much more closely involved in the COP preparations and the current political process, where do you see leadership in the process at the moment? Which are the main countries and coalitions of countries that are driving the process? Of course, the United Kingdom has a responsibility to lead, given that it's chairing next year's COP26, but no country on its own can provide that kind of leadership that will corral others to do more around mitigation. Tell us a bit more about where you see leadership coming from.
Sure, I can have a first go. Am I unmuted? Yes. Perfect. So I think it's a major challenge at the moment. As I mentioned earlier, we were already in a bit of a vacuum in international leadership on climate change before COVID hit. And with the tensions between the UK and the EU, we're not seeing that kind of UK-EU partnership driving the international leadership on climate change. And we're not sure exactly how that's going to unfold, which poses some serious threats to where the source of that international leadership is going to come from. At the moment, the leadership is still coming from the small island developing states, from the Climate Vulnerables Coalition, providing that moral argument and providing their evidence base of ambitious climate action coming from these countries who are already being hit by the impacts of climate change and who haven't got the same foundations to work from. So what we need to see is a bit of a reinvestment in this sort of high ambition coalition approach that emerged in the lead up to the Paris Agreement. We don't have the US at the moment as one of the key drivers of trying to bring that global coalition together. So we need to see the partnership emerging a lot more strongly between the UK and the EU, working with these small island developing states to bring that leadership together. We can't rely just small island developing states with the support of the UN Secretary General to provide that moral and evidence-based leadership.
Shall I, Ashley?
Yes, please do.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, Robert, for your take on the role of the Paris Agreement and this architecture that combines top-down, bottom-up elements and the role of international cooperation. Here I fully agree with you, but looking at the leadership question, indeed, and if we draw the lessons from Paris, for example, when we have seen a triumph of international diplomacy, leadership by the host country, by France, and this shuttle diplomacy and the preparation was absolutely critical for the success of the COP in Paris. And I really believe that the UK presidency can also build on these lessons and even move one step further, of course, in much more complex and complicated geopolitical context. But what is important, on my view, also to keep in mind that this is why we have a COP presidency, to take the political role. And you know, the politics in the COPs are always developed countries vis-a-vis developing countries, and we are really lucky to have as also the current presidency, which is Chile, and the UK government can work very closely with Chile and making the effective preparations for COP26 effective and efficient. This is one component of leadership. The second component is the euro, and in the absence of US in climate change leadership role, EU is really making huge effort to fill in the gap. And they're also working closely with China, but on climate change matters and on the preparation for the COP and so on. But it's not such an easy job, and we have seen already some manifestation of these difficulties at COP25, and I hope that by COP26 this kind of relationship will work better. And last but not least, whatever is done by the COP or by other countries, the lack of leadership by the two major economies, if this remains in case after the US relations, will be extreme challenge for effective delivery of action and ambition at COP26. Thank you.
So we've had some great questions submitted from our audience. One attendee asks, kind of picking up on those discussions that we've had about China and the US, shall we expect climate cooperation as an opportunity for better global governance, particularly after the Democrats taking office? Our attendee is slightly more optimistic about the US election than I am there. We don't want to jinx anything. But if there is that case that the Democrats take office, do the panelists think that climate cooperation would provide an opportunity for better global governance in general?
Shall I have a go at this?
Yes, please.
Okay. Yes, I think I would answer positively to that, because we do have the record of the Obama administration, where there were multiple difficulties with the Chinese, but the climate cooperation that Robert mentioned prior to Paris, November 2014, was clearly, and they talked about this at the time, was clearly an area of their relationship in which they could make progress. So I think it's highly likely, even though I would think that the Democrats would, in other areas such as trade, still be fairly hostile to the Chinese government. I think this is one area where they clearly could work together.
To complement that quickly, I would be definitely in agreement with you, John. I think this is what we're seeing with the EU-China relationship at the moment, where we're seeing increasing kind of issue by issue sort of approach from the EU to where they might cooperate with China and where they might take a more competitive stance. And I think climate change is one of these areas where there is an overarching need for cooperation to bring down emissions globally and to get China on board and to influence China's emissions trajectory. So I would say definitely probably the most promising potential area for cooperation between the US and China with a change in administration.
I can echo that. Clearly, the democratic leadership are very much behind climate multilateralism. And it's interesting to note the Trump position on the Paris Agreement is pretty much out of sync with domestic opinion in the United States, or at least the way it has gone. We see the wildfires in California now bringing home the message that unless people do something about this, this will only get worse. The business community in the US, for the most part, is behind the Paris Agreement. So in a sense, Trump and his team, they're the outlier in this debate. So we can see that the US is likely to re-engage in the process. And there is a chance for a Biden administration to present to the Chinese climate cooperation as the one area where both can make common ground and can actually lower the temperature in the relationship. So there's a strategic opportunity to use climate change to reset the button. But as other speakers have already mentioned, the fundamentals of the great power rivalry are not going away. If anything, the Democrats are as committed as the Trump team is to continue to fight the Chinese over what they consider to be unfair trade practices. And on the technology front, there is now a deeply ingrained rivalry at work that will, I think, negatively impact on climate mitigation. Once low carbon technologies, once the new sort of electric vehicle technologies, battery technology, AI enhanced processes are drawn into that conflict, that's where it gets tricky to collaborate on climate action. And I think this will be a tricky strategic balancing act for a Biden administration, which of course we should remind ourselves is not guaranteed.
But a great question here from Dermot Tawney, who says, a number of speakers have highlighted the importance of trust in international cooperation. But this week, the UK government openly declared its intention to break international law, leading many to question the trustworthiness of the UK government. What impact might this and the UK's broader approach to Brexit have for its ability to host an effective COP26? I think that's a great question. What do you guys make of it?
Shall I start? Okay. Hello, Dermot. Yes, I mean, it can't have a positive effect. And I think the other point about this is it's part of an ongoing struggle with a highly worrying struggle between the current UK government and the EU. One's got to remember that the previous UK position was part of an EU position, and now we have not yet quite worked out where we are in relation to the EU. There are some of the ongoing problems with the EU actually have a climate dimension to them. I believe that one of the issues has been about climate dimensions of trade, and there is a clear difference of opinion between the UK government and the EU about this. So, in general, this, I would say, yes, of course, it's very worrying that that the COP26 president should take this stance, albeit on another issue, but also because of the centrality of the EU to climate politics over the years, and other speakers have mentioned this, it is worrying that I think the internal politics of the EU on climate is damaged by the absence of the UK, which historically has been one of the leaders within the EU in terms of climate policy, but also the weight of the EU overall in the international system and in areas like climate, where it has been important, is lessened by the absence of the EU and by the absence of the UK from the Union. So yes, and it's very worrying.
Great. Katia, what was your response to that?
I would be kind of reluctant to comment on the UK politics, but because trust is such a fundamental issue in international relations and international law, I wanted to emphasize that the whole Paris Agreement, the architecture of the Paris Agreement, and combination of these top-down and bottom-up components, we have in the middle the transparency system and global stocktake. And this is the mechanism that allows to build not only increase ambition, but increase ambition through building trust and confidence that everybody is doing their fair share. And unfortunately, one of the trends that we have seen already at COP25 is kind of a reflection in the UNFCCC process of these big geopolitical shifts and reflection in terms of kind of reducing the degree of trust, which is absolutely essential for delivery in the diplomatic process. And therefore, one of the key jobs for the UK presidency team will be to work with countries and help to rebuild trust by leading by example. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that. Alex and Robert, did you have any comments on that question?
Happy to come in briefly. I mean, it's difficult to say at the moment. We need to see what actually happens, how much of this is rhetoric versus actually followed through. we already knew that the Brexit dynamics were going to be a challenge to the UK in hosting COP26. I mean, to some extent, maybe it's slightly useful that COP26 isn't happening exactly as a hard Brexit might be happening in November this year. And to another extent, I mean, climate change, as we were discussing before, is one of those fundamental global issues on which there is the potential for countries to cooperate, even amongst wider trade tensions and so forth. So I think one of the key questions for the UK is how it will bring a bit more of a climate-centered approach to its foreign policy as the UK charts its own global Britain course in the world after Brexit. And picking up, sorry, one of the other questions as well, thinking through what the key questions for the UK are at the moment with the merger of the Foreign Office and the Department for Development. Where can the UK bring a bit more sense of trust and climate action into its foreign policy by centering climate in the new FCDO structure?
I think the most part of what I was going to say has already been answered. Trust is critical. I should add that the Paris Agreement is, of course, not heavily reliant on legal obligations. It's framed in a way where legal obligations pertain only to, for example, the submission of NDCs, reporting requirements, but then the substance of the implementation of these pledges is left rather less legally binding, and so there's much more room for maneuver. It's a more resilient regime against any government that doesn't stick by the rules as tightly as we might expect it to. So that's interesting that the Paris Agreement is actually much more resilient to those kind of issues. But of course, trust is critical, as other speakers have emphasized. Just on the question of UK leadership, I think the problem with the Brexit debate, and I agree with Alex that it's useful to have the two separated, the Brexit negotiations and the COP process, is that in most successful COPs, we find that the chairs of the COP have done a lot of preparation work in the run-up to the COP. They will have built coalitions behind the scenes at various bilateral, plurilateral levels through other forums. They will have done a lot of legwork. And in the run-up to Paris, it wasn't just the French government, it was the entire EU network of diplomats, including Britain, that was at work building those coalitions. And it surely can't help that Britain, through the Brexit process, is moving ever further away from a sort of close collaboration with the European Union on that. It needs those allies to get a successful outcome out of COP26, and that's my biggest worry in this respect.
Had another question through that I think kind of broadens this discussion out in a really useful way. Nina Aria asks, national level action has been spoken about in regards to the functioning of the Paris Agreement, and I think that picks up on the points just made there. The UK has now concluded its Citizens' Climate Assembly, which was released this morning, where foreign policy and particularly British industry internationally have been omitted from the core of the discussions, which focus instead on individual behaviour change versus systemic change. So Dina asks, how far do you feel that global powers are willing to look at degrowth that addresses global capitalism as part of these diplomatic negotiations?
Well, I'm happy to get us started on that, though I don't have a very encouraging answer to the question. Sorry, Dina. But I don't think degrowth has ever entered the diplomatic debate on this topic, nor will it enter that debate anytime soon. And if I'm allowed to just go back in history a little bit, the rise of environmental norms in international relations, starting in a more serious way in the 1970s, with the Stockholm Conference. It took a long while for international society to accept a responsibility for the environment. And one of the critical fault lines in that debate between pro-environmental and anti-environmental forces was always around the question, but how is it going to impact on development and economic prosperity? And the basic compromise that the international community arrived at in order to establish a global environmental stewardship norm was to say it has to be implemented in a way that it doesn't harm growth and development. And that was critical to developing countries, but also critical to many industrialized countries. And so throughout the decades, we've seen repeated efforts to redefine and redesign environmental policies that both promote environmental protection and economic growth and prosperity. And so it's really difficult to unpick that compromise and say from now on, in order to tackle the climate challenge, we need to emphasize degrowth. That's going to spook a lot of countries that are not at that point in the debate yet, that are still pursuing a long-term economic development growth strategy. So I would simply observe that, politically speaking, in the international context, that's a no-go area. However, from an ecological perspective, it's necessary to go in that direction.
What do the rest of the panel think?
Shall I make a comment? I think it depends how you frame growth. That is the sense. I mean, no government is going to abandon growth because, for obvious reasons, growth is the way in which they get out of their problems in terms of inequality and conflict. Because growth, they always talk. Everybody always talks about growth. The UK government's talking about it now. So it's a question of what you mean by growth. And if I wanted to try and be a little bit optimistic, and I would say this about leadership as well, I would probably look beyond governments in terms of answering this question. If you look at what some big corporations are doing and what even some of the big energy companies are doing, they have a longer perspective. They understand that the kind of growth that we've had in the past is just not going to happen. It's just not possible. The more enlightened ones do. So I think that's where I would look, because I don't think governments are going to openly talk about degrowth, but I think it's happening elsewhere in the sense that ideas of growth the framings of growth are changing elsewhere. And that's generally, in terms of that wider question we had on leadership, so much of the leadership is coming from beyond governments, outside government. And that's one point on which I would try to be optimistic. Okay.
And picking up very quickly on this, I think there are discussions going on in the background, mostly in this regard, looking at things like what are the alternative metrics to GDP growth, and there are some potential champions in that space looking at New Zealand, for example, perhaps not a major power, but potentially a champion, starting to bring that conversation from the private sector or subnational sector into the national government sphere. I think again, as other panelists, very skeptical about this becoming a major discussion point for COP26 or for climate politics in the next decade. But I do think there is a huge need at the moment to address the overarching development paradigm and to come up with imaginative, alternative ways to support vulnerable countries. So I think from that respect, there could be some interesting, innovative ideas coming out of the global system and global discussions this year, but I definitely don't think they'll be titled a degrowth strategy for the world.
I would like to share my take on this quite interesting and challenging question, and I think that looking at individual behavioral changes vis-a-vis systematic changes is perhaps the wrong dichotomy in framing the opportunities for move forward, because I fully agree with Robert that speaking about behavioral changes in international context and in the context of international law is extremely difficult and may not lead to specific results. At least this is the experience for so many years of debate. But when we speak at the international level, I think that looking at individual behavioral changes is very, very important. And actually, many of the policies that governments put in place on climate change at the national level, they're essentially providing incentives and sometimes even a little bit more than incentives, or changing a behavior, for example, moving from cars to public transport, not only by increasing the fuel cost, but also providing alternatives. And my sense is that this is kind of direction in which we'll go more and more in the future. But again, this is, on my view, more of issue of at the national level than in the context of international politics. But in the context of international environmental politics, what is important is really to look at the sustainable development paradigm, which is quite important, and kind of climate change is very closely linked to the way both developed and developing countries are approaching this paradigm from international and international angle. Thank you.
Am I allowed just a final concluding thought on this? The irony is, of course, that the international community has agreed through the Paris Agreement to commit itself to a global strategy of degrowth of emissions. We are internationally committed to staying below 2 degrees and ideally at 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century, which would require a massive decline in emissions. So there is a de facto, de jure commitment to this kind of degrowth, but what the implications are for economic strategy, they've never been spelled out. And the hope is still for most governments to achieve those kind of emission reductions, while other indicators of economic growth will still point upwards. And that's where the challenge lies for governments, to translate that commitment into an economic strategy.
Okay, well, we are running out of time, I'm afraid, but I want to thank all of our panelists for their comments today, for taking their time to kind of come and speak to us. And thank you to all of our attendees, particularly for your really great comments and questions that we've had. It's such a thought-provoking discussion. We'll post the recording of this session and make that available via the PSA website. And we have 2 more panels tomorrow, which are going to pick up on a lot of these themes. In our cross-national comparative session, I imagine we will revisit the topic of America more than once. And in our Build Back Better session, we'll be talking about some of those degrowth sessions. So we hope to see some of you there. And thank you again to our panelists for a really, really great and rich session. So thank you all very much, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, and see you in the virtual space. Thank you.